The leash snapped from Timothy's hand with a force that sent him crashing to the ground, his metal braces clanging against the concrete path like a struck bell. Snow let out a sharp, panicked yelp, the sound of an animal that had never known cruelty and didn't understand it now. A heavy boot pressed into the grass 6 inches from Timothy's face. He could smell the leather. He could smell the cigarettes. He could feel the vibration of laughter in the earth beneath his cheek. "Nice dog, kid." Tyrone crouched down, close enough that Timothy could see the gold tooth glinting in the afternoon sun. "Way too nice for a little gimp like you." The park went silent. 2 mothers near the fountain gathered their children without a word and turned away. A jogger slowed, looked, and kept running. A man on a bench folded his newspaper and stared at the ground. Not one of them moved. Not one of them dared. Then, at the edge of the tree line, something shifted. A man stepped out of the shadows. Broad-shouldered. Quiet. A black tactical K9 at his heel, sitting perfectly still, watching the scene with amber eyes that missed nothing. His name was Johnson. And he had been watching long enough. Before we continue, drop where you're watching from in the comments. Subscribe and stay until the very end. What happens next will remind you that courage is never truly retired. Timothy Hale had only wanted 30 minutes. That was all. Just half an hour in the park with snow before his mother finished her double shift at the laundromat 3 blocks away. 30 minutes of feeling like every other 10-year-old on the planet, not the kid people looked through, not the kid who needed help with the stairs, not the kid whose legs worked differently than everyone else's. Just a boy. And his dog. And a stretch of open path. He'd worn his newer braces today, the ones that didn't chafe as much along the inside of his calves. His mother had saved 4 months for them. He hadn't told her they still left marks. She worried enough already. Snow walked beside him the way she always did, not ahead, not pulling, not distracted by the squirrels rioting in the oak trees overhead. She matched his pace exactly, always slightly angled toward him, close enough that if his balance shifted, her body was already there. She'd been doing it since she was 8 weeks old and Timothy was 6. They had grown up together. They understood each other in a language that had no words. She made him brave. That was the honest truth. Without Snow, the park felt enormous and indifferent. With her, it felt like something he had a right to. He had found his usual spot, the wide paved path near the south fountain, away from the weekend crowds, when he heard them. He knew what they were before he turned around. Timothy had what his mother called old eyes. Eyes that had learned to read a room, read a sidewalk, read a situation, faster than most kids his age. You developed that skill when you spent your whole life arriving somewhere and immediately calculating, how many steps? How many stairs? How long until someone says something? 3 of them. Late teens, maybe early 20s. Moving with the slow, deliberate looseness of people who had decided this afternoon was going to be entertaining. The one in front was Tyrone Wells. Timothy didn't know his name yet. What he knew was the expression, that particular mixture of boredom and hunger that always preceded something ugly. Tyrone was tall, thick across the chest, wearing a white shirt despite the heat, tattoos climbing both forearms. The 2 behind him fanned out slightly as they walked, the way predators instinctively do when they found something smaller than themselves. Their eyes moved past Timothy almost immediately. And locked onto Snow. Here we go, Timothy thought. His hand tightened on the harness handle. His heart began to pound, slow and heavy, the way it did when he already knew how a story ended but had to live through it anyway. "Yo." Tyrone's voice was almost friendly. "Almost. That a service dog?" "Yes." Timothy kept his voice steady. His mother had taught him that, chin up, voice steady, never let them see the shake. "Purebred. She's mine." Tyrone smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. Nothing in those eyes suggested it ever did. Didn't ask who she belonged to. He took a step closer. Snow shifted her body incrementally between the boy and the stranger, a small, precise movement. Her training. Her instinct. Her love, dressed up as a command. She's a working dog, Timothy said. She's federally protected. You can't. He never finished the sentence. Tyrone's hand closed around Snow's harness and pulled. The world lurched. Timothy's grip held for one desperate second. One small, fierce, 10-year-old second of refusing to let go, and then the momentum took him. He went sideways. His brace caught the edge of the path. The concrete came up fast. He heard Snow yelp. He heard laughter. He tasted blood where his lip met the ground. And then the park went very, very quiet. Tyrone's boot pressed into the grass beside Timothy's face. Close. A message. I could, the boot said. But I don't have to. Yet. Nice dog, kid. Way too nice for a little gimp like you. No one moved. Somewhere behind him, Timothy heard the soft footsteps of people choosing to be somewhere else. He pressed his palms to the ground and tried to push himself up. His right brace had twisted. His hands were shaking. Snow was straining against Tyrone's grip, whimpering softly, trying to turn back toward her boy. This is it, Timothy thought. The thought was calm and terrible. This is how I lose her. He hadn't cried yet. He was determined not to. But his eyes burned, and the park blurred, and Snow was still whimpering, and the boot was still in the grass beside his face, and at the far edge of the park, at the boundary where the manicured lawn gave way to the dark wall of trees, something moved. A shape. Quiet. Deliberate. The way things move when they have decided exactly where they are going and exactly what they are going to do when they get there. A man emerged from the tree lean. 6'2", maybe 6'3". Broad. Wearing civilian clothes but carrying himself like a uniform, that particular stillness that certain people possess, the ones who have been places and done things that restructure a person at the cellular level. At his left heel, a black Belgian Malinois sat motionless, watching the scene with a focus that was almost unsettling in its precision. The man didn't run. He didn't shout. He didn't reach for anything. He just walked forward. And something about the way he walked. Something about the angle of his shoulders and the absolute absence of hesitation, made Tyrone's laugh die in his throat before the punchline arrived. His name was Marcus Johnson. Petty Officer First Class, United States Navy, K-9 handler, currently on leave. He had spent 11 years doing very difficult things in very dark places so that children in parks on summer afternoons could feel safe. He had come here today to rest. He had seen what happened to Timothy from the moment they walked through the gate. And Marcus Johnson had decided, without drama, without announcement, the way he decided most things. Not today. Marcus Johnson covered the distance in 12 seconds. Timothy counted them from the ground, not because he was calm enough to count, but because his mind had gone to that strange, distant place it sometimes went when things got too big to process in real time. 1. 2. 3. The boot was still in the grass beside his face. 4. 5. Snow was still whimpering. 6. 7. Tyrone had finally noticed the man walking toward him and had stopped laughing. 8. 9. The two gang members behind Tyrone shifted their weight, exchanging a glance. 10. 11. Shadow, the black Malinois, had not made a single sound. 12. Johnson stopped 6 feet away. The park was so quiet Timothy could hear the fountain. Put the harness down. Johnson's voice was low. Conversational. The kind of voice that didn't need to be loud because it had never needed volume to be obeyed. Do it slow. Do it now. Tyrone's jaw tightened. He was a big man, and big men in front of their crew could not be seen to flinch. Timothy understood that, even at 10. The problem for Tyrone was that Marcus Johnson was not reading from the same script. He stood there with his hands loose at his sides and his eyes fixed on Tyrone with an expression that contained no anger whatsoever. No threat. No posturing. Just absolute, surgical certainty. The giant behind Tyrone decided to be the one. He lunged forward. All 280 pounds of him, and what happened next took less time than it takes to blink. Johnson moved left, pivoted, and the giant's own momentum carried him past and down, his face meeting the earth with a sound that shook the air. The wiry one reached into his jacket. Shadow was on him in an instant. Not biting, not tearing, just planted on his chest with her paws and her amber eyes and the full theological weight of 11 years of SEAL training, and the man went completely, utterly still. Tyrone dropped the harness. Snow was back at Timothy's side before Tyrone had finished deciding to run. She pressed her whole body against the boy, all 60 pounds of her, and Timothy wrapped both arms around her neck and buried his face in her fur and finally let himself shake. He heard footsteps. Running. Fading. Gone. Then a large, careful hand on his shoulder. Hey. Johnson crouched to Timothy's level. His voice was different now. Softer. The way a man's voice gets when the mission is over and the person in front of him is a child. You're okay. She's okay. Look at me. Timothy looked up. What's your name? Timothy. Timothy. Johnson said it the way you say a name when you want a person to remember they have one. You held on. You hear me? When he pulled, you held on. That matters. If you've ever had someone see you, really see you, in a moment when you felt completely invisible, then you know what happened to Timothy's face in that second. If you haven't, pay attention. Because some moments are worth watching twice. Drop where you're watching from in the comments right now. And if this story is already hitting somewhere deep, share it. Someone in your life needs to hear this today. Johnson walked him home. It was 4 blocks. Timothy usually managed it fine, Snow calibrated to his pace, the braces doing what they were designed to do, but his hands hadn't stopped trembling and twice his right knee nearly buckled on the uneven sidewalk. Johnson walked on his left side without comment, close enough that if Timothy went down, he wouldn't go far. He didn't. But it helped to know. Sadie Hale opened the front door before they reached the porch steps. She had that mother's radar. The one that sounds no alarm, makes no noise, simply knows, and she was already scanning her son from head to toe before Johnson had introduced himself. The split lip. The torn knee of his jeans. The way he was carrying himself, the particular exhaustion of a child who has survived something. Timothy. Just his name. Just his name, in her voice, and he walked up those 3 steps and into her arms and the trembling got worse before it got better. Johnson waited on the porch. He watched Shadow sit patiently at his heel and stared at the street and gave them their moment. He was good at that, at being present without intruding. 11 years of operating in other people's crises had taught him which silences to fill and which ones to protect. When Sadie finally looked at him over her son's shoulder, her eyes were wet and her jaw was set and she said, very quietly, "Tell me everything." They sat at her kitchen table. Timothy fell asleep on the couch with Snow curled against his legs, one small hand buried in the dog's fur even in sleep, still holding on. Sadie wrapped both hands around a mug of coffee that went cold while Johnson talked. And the further he got into the story, the stiller she became. He went straight for the harness, Johnson said. Not Timothy's jacket. Not his backpack. The harness. Like he knew exactly what he was looking for. Something moved behind Sadie's eyes. Recognition. The kind you don't want to have. This isn't the first time, she said. It wasn't a question. She told him about the car that had slowed outside the park 2 weeks ago. The man who had asked Timothy, very kindly, very casually, what breed Snow was, how old, where they'd gotten her. Timothy had thought nothing of it. People asked about Snow all the time. But the car had been parked there when they arrived and still there when they left, and something about it had made Sadie watch the street from her window for a week afterward. They weren't after drug money. They weren't after a quick sale. They had been hunting Snow. Specifically. Deliberately. 4 weeks. If this story is making the hair on the back of your neck stand up, subscribe right now and stay with us. Because what we found out next will break your heart before it makes you furious. They came at 9 the following morning. 2 patrol cars, no sirens. Officers Jerry Hollis and Tony Carver. Timothy saw them from his bedroom window and came downstairs to find his mother already at the door, arms crossed, face composed in the way that women who have been surviving difficult things for a long time learn to compose themselves, like a wall that has decided to be decorative about it. The story, according to Officer Jerry, was that a complaint had been filed. An assault. A man matching Johnson's description had allegedly attacked 3 young men in Riverside Park the previous afternoon, leaving one hospitalized. Very serious. Very serious indeed. They'd need to come inside. Ask a few questions. Speak to the boy. Sadie did not move from the doorway. My son was attacked, she said. A man defended him. You have the wrong story. Officer Jerry smiled the smile of a man who knows exactly which story he's been sent to tell. Ma'am, we just need to. You need to leave my porch. Johnson was already on his way. Mariah, the neighbor across the street who saw everything and forgot nothing, had called him within 4 minutes of the cruiser's arriving. He pulled up as Officer Tony was attempting to peer through the living room window, and the look on both officers' faces when they registered who had just stepped out of the truck suggested they had been briefed on Johnson, and had been hoping not to meet him in person. The conversation lasted 8 minutes. Johnson spoke quietly and specifically about federal statutes, about body cameras, about the names of his JAG contacts, about how unusual it was that a complaint from 3 men who had fled a public park had been processed, assigned, and dispatched in under 18 hours. Officer Jerry's smile got smaller with each sentence. Officer Tony stopped taking notes. They left. Sadie stood in her kitchen afterward and pressed both hands flat on the counter and breathed. Timothy stood in the doorway watching his mother hold herself together and felt something new move through him, not fear, not shame. Something older. Something quieter. Anger. The clean kind. The kind that doesn't burn down. The kind that builds. For every parent watching this who has ever had to stand between their child and a system that was supposed to protect them, this one is for you. Like this video. Share it. Let's make sure this story finds the people who need it. Johnson made 3 calls that night. He did not sleep. By 2 in the morning he was sitting at Sadie's kitchen table with a laptop and a yellow legal pad and a look on his face that Timothy, watching from the hallway in his pajamas, had never seen on an adult before. Not anger. Not worry. Something colder and more deliberate. The face of a man assembling a picture piece by piece and not liking what the picture was showing him. His contact at Naval Intelligence, a woman named Reed who owed him a favor and had the clearance to pull certain threads, had found the first thread in under an hour. Councilman James Whitfield's charitable organization, Companions for America, had been matching high-value service animals with disabled veterans and children for 6 years. Heartwarming press releases. Generous donors. A glossy website with photographs of dogs and grateful families. 53 animals placed in the last 2 years. 11 of those animals were currently unaccounted for. Not deceased. Not rehomed. Unaccounted for. Vanished from the records with the quiet, deliberate efficiency of someone who knew exactly where the paperwork lived and how to make it say nothing. Snow was a $70,000 animal. Fully trained. Federally certified. Registered. Microchipped. And Councilman Jim's office had handled the paperwork for her placement with the Hale family 18 months ago. Johnson sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he looked down at Snow, asleep on Timothy's feet in the hallway, the boy's hand trailing in her fur, both of them breathing slow and steady in the dark. He thought about what it meant. That someone had looked at that dog and seen a commodity. That someone had looked at that boy and seen an obstacle. That someone with a title and a press release and a charity gala had built a machine out of broken trust and broken animals and broken families, and had been running it in plain sight for years. His jaw set. Not today, he had thought at the park. He thought it again now. And this time it meant something larger. Something that would require more than 12 seconds and a Malinois and the certainty in his hands. This time, it was going to require everything. Mariah Vasquez had lived across the street from the Hales for 11 years. She was 63 years old, 5 feet tall, and possessed of the particular superpower that belongs exclusively to older women who have raised children in hard neighborhoods. She noticed everything, forgot nothing, and moved on information faster than any intelligence network Johnson had ever worked with. She came across the street at 6:15 in the evening, still wearing her apron, and she didn't knock. She walked straight to where Sadie was standing at the sink and she said, without preamble, "They're coming back tonight. I heard Tyrone on his phone in the alley. He said Johnson won't be there. He said take the dog and don't leave witnesses." The word witnesses landed in the kitchen like something dropped from a great height. Sadie turned off the faucet. She set down the dish. She stood very still for 3 seconds the way she always did when something required her to be stronger than she felt. Then she turned around and said, "Timothy. Come here, baby." He came. He always came when she used that voice. Snow came with him, pressed to his left leg, reading the room the way she always did, the slight elevation in tension, the way Sadie's hands had gone still. Sadie crouched to his level. She took his face in both hands the way she had done since he was small enough to carry, and she looked at him with those eyes that had never once lied to him, and she said, "I need you to be brave for me. Not the pretend kind. The real kind. Can you do that?" He nodded. His throat was too tight for words. "Snow has to hide. And you have to be the one to help her do it." The crawl space was beneath the back bedroom. An old coal access from when the house was built, barely 3 feet high, invisible behind a section of baseboard that Sadie had never told anyone about because some hiding places need to stay secret until they're needed. Timothy had discovered it at age 7 and kept the knowledge the way children keep the best things, quietly, completely, without a word. He went in first, on his hands and knees, his braces scraping softly on the concrete. Snow followed without hesitation, without a sound. Her training held even here, even in the dark and the dust and the smell of old wood, because her training was built on love, and love does not require comfort to function. Timothy sat in the dark with his back against the foundation wall and Snow's head in his lap and listened to the sounds of the house above him. Footsteps. Mariah's voice. His mother's voice. Silence. More silence. And then, much later, the sound of a car moving slowly down the street. Stopping. An engine idling. He pressed his hand over Snow's muzzle, their signal, practiced 100 times in 100 games that had never been meant to matter. She went perfectly still. Not a breath. Not a shift of weight. Just stillness, and the faint rhythm of her heartbeat under his palm, steady and true. They stayed that way for 41 minutes. When his mother finally opened the baseboard panel and the light fell in, Timothy did not cry. He wanted to. But Snow looked up at him first. Those dark, liquid eyes finding his face in the way they always did, the way that said "I'm here, I've got you, we're okay," and something in his chest settled. He scratched behind her ear and whispered, "Good girl." She had been. She always was. If you have ever hidden something precious because the world felt too dangerous to keep it in the light, you know what this boy felt in that crawlspace. Subscribe. Share where you're watching from. Because this story is not finished yet, and what comes next will change everything. Johnson came back the next morning with a plan and a topographic map and the particular focus quiet of a man who has already run the scenario 16 different ways in his head and chosen the best one. He spread the map on Sadie's kitchen table and looked at Timothy and said something that no adult had ever said to the boy before. I need your help. Specifically yours. Nobody else can do what I'm about to ask you to do. Timothy looked at the map. Then at Johnson. What do you need? The councilman's rural estate sat on 40 acres outside the city, behind a stone wall and a camera system and the kind of confident invisibility that wealth and political protection provide. Johnson could get close. Shadow could get closer. But the hidden entrance, if it existed, would be in a place no adult body could access without triggering the perimeter sensors. Low. Narrow. Below the sight line of every camera on the property. The exact dimensions of a small boy and a very well-trained dog. They went at dusk. Johnson parked half a mile out and they moved through the tree line the way Johnson moved through everything, quietly, deliberately, close to the ground. Timothy had never done anything like this in his life. His braces were the newer ones, the quieter ones, and he focused on every footfall the way Snow had taught him to focus on things. Completely, without the noise of fear. It was Snow who found it. She stopped at the base of the stone wall's northeast corner, her nose working, her body going into that precise, electric stillness that meant something was there. Timothy crouched beside her. Ran his hand along the base of the wall where moss had been growing over what looked like solid stone but wasn't, a seam, barely visible, the outline of a hatch no wider than a storm drain cover. He looked back at Johnson. Johnson looked at the hatch. At the boy. At the dog. And something moved across his face that Timothy would remember for the rest of his life, not pride exactly. Something bigger. The expression of a man who has seen courage in a great many forms and has just encountered a new one. Good eyes, Timothy, he said quietly. It was the second time Johnson had said something like that. Timothy was beginning to understand that this man did not say things he didn't mean, which made every word land differently. For everyone watching who has ever been told their limitations define them, watch this boy. Like this video. Stay with us. The next hour is the one that matters. They went in at midnight. Johnson had spent 48 hours preparing what he called the package. Shadow's tactical harness, 2 body cameras, a tablet preloaded with the estate's electronic gate schematics, courtesy of Reed at Naval Intelligence, and a federal warrant that had been signed that afternoon by a judge who had read the file on Councilman Jim's charity and gone very, very quiet. Timothy sat in the dark at the edge of the tree line with the tablet in his lap and Johnson's voice in the single earpiece and Snow pressed against his side, and he was more frightened than he had ever been. He wanted to tell Johnson that. He wanted to say, I'm 10 years old and my hands are shaking and I don't know if I can do this. Instead he opened the gate schematics and started reading. The system had 3 layers. The first was straightforward. A simple digital key that Reed had already cracked and left waiting. Timothy entered the sequence in 11 seconds. The outer gate released with a sound like an exhaled breath. The second layer was a sensor array that required a simultaneous input across 4 nodes, the kind of thing designed to require 2 operators. Johnson had told him this part would be hard. Timothy split the screen, mapped his fingers across the 4 inputs, and hit them in sequence so fast that Johnson said, very quietly into the earpiece, "Where did you learn to do that?" "Video games," Timothy whispered. A pause. Then, barely audible, something that might have been a laugh. "I'll be damned." The inner gate opened. Johnson and Shadow moved through it like smoke. And Timothy sat in the dark with his heart in his throat and Snow's warm weight against his leg and waited, because waiting is sometimes the bravest thing. It was Shadow who alerted first. A single low sound, barely a vibration, that brought Johnson to a stop 20 yards from the kennel entrance. He held. Listened. Then came the sound he had not accounted for, a door opening from the inside. And Councilman James Whitfield stepping out into the dark with a flashlight and the expression of a man who has survived his entire life by being the most dangerous thing in any given room. He wasn't the most dangerous thing in this one. But he didn't know that yet. What happened next happened fast. Jim swept the flashlight across the yard, missed Johnson by 12 feet, and then swept it back toward the hatch, toward the small, low entrance in the base of the wall. And the beam landed on Timothy. The boy had come in. He hadn't been able to stay outside. He had heard something, a sound he would later describe only as wrong, an animal sound, the kind that reaches past your thinking brain and hits something older, and he had gone through the hatch because Snow was already moving and he would not be separated from her. He was standing in the kennel corridor when Jim's flashlight found him. The room was full of cages. Dozens of them. And in those cages were animals, beautiful, trained, bewildered animals who turned their faces toward the light with the devastating patience of creatures who had been waiting a very long time to be found. Timothy saw them and felt something rupture open in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet. He would, later. The word was grief. The word was fury. The word was enough. Jim crossed the room in 4 strides. His voice was low and vicious. You have no idea what you've walked into, boy. He raised his hand. Snow broke her stay. 60 pounds of white dog moving at full speed is not a thing you stop with a raised hand. She hit Jim at chest height. Not biting, not tearing, simply landing, her paws on his shoulders and her eyes on his face and a sound in her throat that Timothy had never heard from her before. The sound of something that has decided. Jim stumbled back against the cages and the flashlight hit the floor and spun, and in the wheeling light Timothy saw Johnson come through the main entrance with Shadow at his heel and 2 federal agents behind him, and it was over. It was over. Timothy stood in the middle of that kennel corridor with cages on both sides and Snow coming back to him, back from Jim, back to her boy, pressing her whole body against his legs, trembling for the first time in her life, and he put both arms around her and held on. He was crying. He didn't try to stop it. There was nothing left in him that wanted to perform being fine. I've got you, he whispered into her fur. I've got you. I've got you. I've got you. It's what she had been saying to him for 4 years. He finally understood how to say it back. If you are crying right now, you are supposed to be. Share this. Subscribe. Send this to someone who needs to believe that the good guys still show up. Because they do. Keep watching. Sally Mercer broke the story at 6 the next morning. She was 29 years old and worked for the city's second-largest paper and had been trying to crack Councilman Jim's charity for 8 months without enough evidence to print. The federal case file that landed in her inbox at 5:47 a.m., courtesy of an anonymous source who typed with the precision and economy of someone trained to communicate clearly in difficult environments, contained everything. Wire transfers. Falsified placement records. 11 missing animals recovered. For additional properties linked to the trafficking network across 3 states. By noon the story had been picked up nationally. By 3 in the afternoon, Councilman James Whitfield had resigned. By evening, his photograph was no longer on the Companions for America website because the website no longer existed. Officer Jerry and Officer Tony were placed on administrative leave pending review. Tyrone Wells was arrested at his uncle's property. And Timothy Hale, 10 years old, leg braces, fierce heart, was asked to submit a written statement for a federal hearing that would be used in the prosecution of the largest service animal trafficking ring in the state's history. He wrote it himself. His mother read it over his shoulder and did not correct a single word. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning when the light was the particular gold that only happens in early autumn, Timothy walked Snow through Riverside Park. The same path. The same fountain. The same trees at the boundary where a man had once stepped out of the shadows and changed everything. His head was up. It had been since the kennel, since the moment he had held Snow in that corridor and understood something about himself that no one had ever been able to tell him because it was the kind of knowledge that can only be earned. He was not a burden. He was not a limitation. He was a 10-year-old boy who had unlocked 2 security gates in the dark, found a hidden entrance that trained adults had missed, and written a federal statement that a judge would later call the clearest testimony I have received in 20 years on the bench. Snow walked beside him. Matched his pace. Angled toward him the way she always did. The park was full today. A Saturday crowd. People jogged past. Children ran toward the fountain. A woman pushed a stroller. No one stared. Or maybe they did, and for the first time in his life, Timothy didn't feel it. He found the bench near the south path and sat for a moment, Snow settling at his feet, both of them turning their faces toward the sun. From the bench 20 yards away, Marcus Johnson watched. Shadow sat at his heel. Johnson had a cup of coffee. He was not in uniform. He looked, for the first time since Timothy had met him, like a man who was actually resting. He caught Timothy's eye across the distance. Said nothing. Gave one small nod. Timothy nodded back. It was the whole conversation. It contained everything. There is a kind of loneliness that lives in the body, in the extra seconds it takes to climb 3 steps, in the eyes that look away on the subway, in the word gimp spoken by a stranger who thought cruelty was the same as power. Timothy Hale had carried that loneliness since he was old enough to understand that the world was not built with him in mind. He didn't carry it anymore. Not because the world had changed. The world was still the world, complicated and careless and full of people who looked away at the wrong moment. But Timothy had changed. He knew now what Snow had always known, that love is not a comfort. It's a command. It's the thing that breaks your stay and puts itself between the person you belong to and everything that would harm them. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. Good girl, he thought. She wagged once. Slowly. The way she did when she knew. He stood up. Adjusted his braces. And walked forward. If this story reached something in you that needed reaching, please subscribe. Share where you're watching from in the comments. Tell us about a bond in your life that held when everything else let go. This community exists because of you. Thank you for staying until the end. Timothy and Snow are not finished. Neither are we.